Welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs, a podcast for the lit curious reader, because why not read a little bit of everything? I'm Jennifer Smith.
I'm Joey Kelly.
And today we are celebrating another episode in our June of Art series with none other than Honore de Balzac and his short story, The Unknown Masterpiece, which was first published in 1831. This story explores what it means to create a perfect work of art, which is very fitting with our theme, and what happens when the pursuit of perfection destroys the artist entirely, which in essence is basically Balzac's own life story. But when he wrote it, I don't think he knew that was how his end was going to come. But before we go there, Joey, do we want to talk about a piece of art that we love?
Sure. Hopefully we didn't pick the same one.
There is 0.001% that you picked what I picked.
Okay, I picked a Picasso. You did not pick Picasso. Picasso actually was inspired by this story. And as I was reading more about Balzac, I found this information that Picasso made a painting based on the painting that is described, the unknown masterpiece itself. So it's called The Weeping Woman. And I thought it was just interesting that he read this work and was so inspired by it that he decided to manifest it into a physical art form. That ties back into what we were saying last week about how art is, you're inspired by someone else's inspiration and so on and so forth, back and forth. So that's a good example of how that is done in an ethical and beautiful way.
Like a complimentary way, right?
Yes,
he was just getting inspired and passing that inspiration on. And Joey, I did not pick that. However, in my research about Balzac, because I didn't know a lot about him, although looking back at my reading history in that New York City book club we belonged in, we read 2 books by Balzac. And I'm like, apparently I love them so much, I promptly forgot. But when I saw the titles, I was like, oh yes, I remember you. I remember you, old friend. And I looked up 2 of the paintings of the 2 painters that he referenced just to see what their styles were back in the 1600s. And I'm like, nope, and no, not for me. So I took a hard pivot, Joey, and I picked something that I saw when I was in Phoenix a couple of months ago by Eric Fiskel, and it was called Barbecue. And it was in his collection, Stories Told. And every one of his paintings, they were huge, like 10 by 12, just monstrous life-size paintings that depict very normal scenes or extraordinary scenes in life. And so the particular one that I picked is actually, and again, more storytelling with his story, is owned by Steve Martin and his wife. So I just thought that was also interesting. I'm like, of course, Steve Martin, comedic genius, loves the energy in this painting, which is a quintessential barbecue scene. The dad's grilling, the kid is blowing this big plume of fire out. There's a lot going on in that picture. What in the world is the story behind this painting? So, Joey, that is the painting that I picked. 3 things to know about Honore de Balzac. I would love to share those because I found these really interesting. Item number 1, he had grand ambitions from the start. He was born in 1799 in the Loire Valley in France, which coincidentally is the same year that Napoleon came to power. So he was dealing with those situations his entire life. Balzac spent his life with similarly grand ambitions. He wanted to really do something beautiful with his talent. His name sounds like it is aristocratic, and that was partly by design because his father decided to add the D to the Balzac to make the family name sound a bit more distinguished. So again, even his father was being fanciful. Balzac abandoned his law career in his 20s, was not for him. He failed at several business ventures, and then he spent the rest of his life in crushing debt. But he was able to write his way out of it at a pace that defies belief. He would write for 16 to 18 hours a day. He drank dozens of cups of coffee. I was like, that guy was a machine. In his short life, he did produce about 100 novels and short stories.
That's a lot of writing.
That's a lot of writing. It's like fueled by caffeine, fueled by coffee in the 1830s and 40s. The second interesting thing about him is that he brought literary realism to life. So he wrote The Human Comedy, and it is a panoramic portrait of French society in all its ambition, greed, desire. He was living it, he was reporting it, he was fictionalizing it, but he was definitely drawing on his own observed experience. He's widely considered one of the founders of literary realism, a movement in fiction that emerged, as we said, in the early 1800s in Europe. And it's very straightforward, but it's also revolutionary. Their premise was, you're going to love this, Joey, novels should depict the world as it actually is, not as some idealized or romanticized version of it. So he was giving us very real life descriptions of things instead of relying on all of this fluffiness of the romantics that came before him. Flaubert, Zola, Proust, Dostoevsky, and our friend Henry James all acknowledged their debt to him. The phrase, he is really the father of us all, is attributed to Henry James, who in 1905 gave a lecture here in Philadelphia called The Lessons of Balzac, and that was later published in the Atlantic Monthly. So Henry James, very affected by the works of Balzac. And the third interesting thing, and I will leave it here, Joey, is that Balzac's life echoes his work. In 1850, he finally marries a Polish noblewoman, so his nod to the aristocracy is finally fulfilled, that he had corresponded with for nearly 20 years. And they get married, and 5 months later, he dies. He's completely worn out at 51. That makes sense. He wrote 16 to 18 hours a day, fueled by all of those cups of coffee, and he basically worked himself to death. And at his funeral, Victor Hugo said all of his books form but one book. He had this beautiful body of work that they just pulled all together. And lucky for us, Balzac left behind nearly 100 novels and or short stories, which are very much alive and are being read today. He also influenced Edith Wharton. So it was interesting that Henry James and Edith Wharton were also following this tradition of realism, social commentary, not glossing over the ills of society.
Yeah, it's funny when we find someone who is so influential to so many big writers like that. I didn't know. I'd heard of Balzac before, but I didn't know that he was so influential. Here's a summary for the story that we read today, The Unknown Masterpiece. This story follows three painters in 17th century Paris: the young, ambitious Nicolas Poussin, the respected Franz Porbus, and the obsessive old master Fraunhofer, who has spent 10 years in secret labor on what he believes to be the greatest painting ever made. When Fraunhofer finally unveils his masterpiece, all that greets them is a wall of chaotic paint, formless and indecipherable, except for one exquisite foot emerging from the chaos. Undone by his colleague's failure to see what he sees, Fraunhofer burns his life's work and dies amid the ashes. It's a story about artistic obsession, the gap between vision and execution, and the impossibility of ever fully capturing reality. Written in 1831, as you mentioned, its reach has been enormous. Cézanne famously declared, "I am Fraunhofer," and Balzac's broader body of work casts a long shadow over artists and writers in the generations since. Fraunhofer's quest for perfection served as inspiration to Pablo Picasso, who chose his own studio in Paris based on the location described in the book. Picasso also illustrated the Book of Artists, Livre d'Artiste edition of the story. If you look at the weeping woman that is said to have been inspired by this story, it's not as what's described, but I think it describes another part of the story. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Just look at the painting and read the story, and that's great. That's a cool thing that you could do.
And you can decide for yourself.
Yeah, then you can decide where he got that inspiration or if he was correct.
And I love, Joey, as you mentioned earlier, how many people and generations of not only writers, but artists, sculptors. I did see that there was a very famous Rodin sculpture that he created of Balzac that during his time, people did not like it at all. So it was sort of hidden away. And then years later, it was put out on public display. And obviously, this was in the early 1800s to 1850. That is when he passed away. So we're just kind of thinking we didn't have photographs at that time. So you either got a statue made of you or a painting or someone did a line drawing, but there weren't a lot of other ways to be captured. And I thought that was interesting. Joy, I thought one of the things that we might do in the spirit of art, which I am just really loving, our June theme, is to talk about a couple of things that each of us really pulled out of the story. And I will start with one that really struck me, and then I'd love to hear one from you. This story was very much a modern fable or a parable about the desire to perfect something so much that it consumes you. And at the end, perfection is not possible. The people around you literally do not see it. It's like, but I've spent 10 years putting this one little hair on her eyebrow. And they're like, yeah, we didn't see any of that. It's just a mess. This story, in the way that he told it as a parable, felt a little bit like historical fiction to me before that was a thing, because he takes two actual people who were painters at that time in the early 1600s, and he weaves them into the story along with a fantastical, mysterious being. And when I was reading it, I'm like, is this guy a vampire? Is this a Dorian Gray situation? Something really weird going on here. So I think I love the structure of the story, giving you a lot of ambiguous signals of, is the guy crazy? Is he a genius? Is he a vampire? Is he killing these women? Are they going to be reincarnated in some way? It was just very mysterious to me. What about you, Joey?
I think the idea of obsession is prevalent in this story as well as in the Circular Ruins and in the Picture of Dorian Gray. Obsession in art feels like it really goes hand in hand, as I was also talking about last week with our Borges story on the Circular Ruins. And I think this is no exception to that, because we have Fraunhofer, who has been working on this. I think he said it was for about 10 years, if not more. And to me, I felt like there was a parasocial relationship here. And so this is what Balzac writes. What, he cried piteously at last, show my creation, my bride, rend the veil that kept my happiness sacred. It would be an infamous profanation. For 10 years I have lived with her. She is mine, mine alone. She loves me. Has she not smiled at me at each stroke of the brush upon the canvas? She has a soul, the soul that I have given her. She would blush if any eyes but mine should rest on her. And then he goes on a little bit of a rant there. I think that's a good example of that. First of all, he has been very much obsessed with this. He's kept it a secret and has been diligently working on it in the background without anyone seeing it. And that he has really personified this woman in the painting, where he literally thinks he is imbuing this painting with a soul and is able to communicate with it. This is very similar to the Circular Ruins. This is the dream of a dreamed man kind of thing.
Yeah, Joey, I love that you said that, because he's a painter. He's creating pieces of art to be displayed. Generally, that's what a painter would do. And Balzac has Frauenhofer say, when you make a painting for the royal court, because at that time they still had kings and queens and all that courtly stuff, you don't put your soul in it. This is a private painting. This is just for me. And when they finally get into his studio, he sees all these cast-offs of drafts and other things they've done. And they're like, these are great. This is going to be awesome. If this is his trash, imagine what the real painting is going to look like. And the guys are standing in front of it and they're like, Joey, I don't see anything in here. And you're like, yeah, me neither. And then the part I loved about the humor, but it was tragic, is that the guy's like, you're just jealous. You can't acknowledge how great my painting is. And they're like, well, actually, we don't see anything at all. And then they see that one little beautiful human foot on the side of the painting. They're like, hey, maybe there was something there. Maybe he did. And the idea of gilding the lily, you have something beautiful, but it's like, I just need one more thing. Oh, wait, no, just one more thing. And it reminded me of editing. If you can continue and continue, it's like, if you don't put your work out, what is the point? But it was very paradoxical, I think, for him to say, as a painter, the person he was painting, as it was described in the story, was a famous courtesan. So she was known for her seduction and for her outward sexuality that was prized in that society. So the idea of concealing her and not letting her out was also a little creepy. Definitely given some of the vibes from last week. And also they reference Prometheus. So again, who's imbuing life? Does it make you crazy? Is it noble? Is it creepy? What's really going on here?
Yeah, I think the question that Balzac raises in this story is, what makes something good art or noteworthy art? Because obviously we have two different parties here, the two guys, and then Fraunhofer, who is saying, this is art. Before You is a masterpiece. And they're like, bro, that's a mess. That's a mess. Like, that foot, that was good. You got it right with that foot, but the rest of this is a hot ass mess. And so I think what Fraunhofer says, it's interesting to get his reaction when they're like, I literally don't see anything on this canvas. I'm not trying to be mean about it, but like, there's nothing there.
Wait, because you just coined a term for me accidentally. It's his masterpiece.
Yeah,
Just a hot
his
mess.
masterpiece. Okay,
It's his masterpiece.
so Balzac writes, "Aha," he cried, "you did not expect to see such perfection. You are looking for a picture and you see a woman before you. There is such depth in that canvas. The atmosphere is so true that you cannot distinguish it from the air that surrounds us. Where is art? Art has vanished. It is invisible. It is the form of a living girl that you see before you. Have I not caught the very hues of life, the spirit of the living line that defines the figure? Is there not the effect produced there like that which all natural objects present in the atmosphere about them or fishes in the water? Do you see how the figure stands out against the background? Does it not seem to you that you pass your hand along the back? But then for 7 years I studied and watched how the daylight blends with the object on which it falls, and the hair that light pours over it like a flood. Does it not? She breathed. I am sure that she breathed. Her breast. See, who would not fall on his knees before her? Her pulses throb. She will rise to her feet. Wait." So obviously he is trying to sell, like, this is literally the best thing you've ever seen. It is so realistic. It could be a photograph. If not, like, he is actually trapping this woman in a little canvas, which is kind of giving me Charlotte Perkins Gilman vibes there with the yellow wallpaper. It is an interesting idea that he's making us think about that. Why are they seeing it so differently? Why can Fraunhofer see the exact vision that's in his head? And we said this in the beginning. How do you take your idea and make it a reality? Your expectation versus reality of your art. I'm sure that writers like Balzac, even though they had that same issue where you're like, I know that I have this idea in my head and it's just not coming out.
I appreciate that because we often say, who is this story for? And in some ways, when we hear that Picasso and Cézanne and other graphic artists, right, painters, sculptors were inspired by this work, he tells us what art needs to be classified as good art. And he says anyone can copy and mimic a line and duplicate something that doesn't have the soul of a person in it. It doesn't feel like you could reach out and touch it. One of the lines, Joey, that I wanted to read on that part is specifically giving instruction about who gets the credit for putting the final touches on. One of the things that Balzac does a great job of is describing the artistic process and how this painter, this master, is teaching novice and experienced painter who thinks he's at the top of his game, but the master comes and he's like, yeah, you're not all that. Balzac says, "The aim of art is not to copy nature, but to express it. You are not a servile copyist, but a poet," cried the old man sharply, putting Porbus short with an imperious gesture. Otherwise, a sculptor might make a plaster cast of a living woman and save himself all further trouble. Well, try to make a cast of your mistress's hand and set the thing before you. You will see it as a monstrosity, a dead mass, bearing no resemblance to the living hand. For me, that was also bringing back feelings of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, who bestows life. You think you have this image in your head, it's going to be great, without the electric soul of what we would call humanity. It's just dead, rotting flesh before you, and it will never be beautiful. It was just so interesting how, because we've read so much together and all of these themes that are really so beautifully woven, and it's just beautifully told, Joey. I know French writers are your thing. You're very down with that. And I'm always
Love
like, I
French
don't
writers.
know. I really did enjoy reading it with this beautiful, colorful language. It was really good. So, long story short, as we always say, just read the story, just get it firsthand and see what your experience was.
Yeah. It's interesting that Prometheus is specifically called out, and we called out Prometheus last time. We keep calling it back to Frankenstein. Well, we're going to have to see if we can keep it up. How can we relate everything back to Frankenstein this month? But I think for me, it just underscores this idea that creativity and art is a life-giving process. You have to birth your creativity into the world, and obviously this has to be like Frankenstein or the Prometheus myth there. So many of these things just make a lot of sense when we're discussing stories about art and creativity, where you have to be obsessed, you have to be imaginative, and you have to provide a piece of yourself as the artist into your creation. So whether it's your writing, your monster, if you're Victor Frankenstein, or your painting, if you could be any of the painters that we just mentioned today, we'll say Picasso. A little piece of yourself has to go into that. And as you read with the plaster hand, you cannot copy and paste art. I think that's interesting when we think about sort of anachronistically, if we think about AI, which we have also been discussing, where you need to imbue it with something else. And I think the perfect example was the Picasso painting and this Balzac story, where you can have an homage or an inspiration, but you cannot copy and paste. That's not how art is created.
That is not how art is created, Joey. And I want to finish the quote that we started because this perfectly dovetails into what you were just talking about. If you try to do a cast of your mistress's hand, you're not really going to get the full effect. And it said you would be compelled to have recourse of the chisel of a sculptor who, without making an exact copy, would represent for you its movement and its life. We must detect the spirit, the informing soul in the appearance of things and being. And throughout this entire work of literature, he talks about the lighting up of a painting by making dark shadows, which then makes the whites more vivid. He's like, don't make a two-dimensional object. You want to have the women in your painting look like they could turn their heads so you can see every direction. When he was talking to the more experienced artist, he's like, you don't have it. Whatever that secret sauce is, you don't have it. Let me show you. And he just took a few brush strokes and he's like, I'll just do a little here and a little here. For me, it felt like what a good editor can do for somebody's piece of literature. Just a few little touch-ups and it's going to make the whole thing pop. There was a quote Balzac put in there that was really interesting and instructive for others. He says a couple of things. One, he says, you at least have color there and feeling and drawing, the three essentials of art. So you have to have color, you have to have feeling, and you have to have drawing. And then he says, it's all there, and yet it is not there. What is lacking? A nothing, but that nothing is everything. And so he's trying to remind the person that there's a secret, there's a little bit of you that has to go in it that you can't just pull out. It can't just be a reproduction. There has to be a little spark of humanity in it. Does that make sense, Joey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good example of apprenticeship or mentorship. And that's still a very necessary part of artistry and creativity, is that it is very beneficial to have someone come in that is way more experienced than you or more talented and come in and say, hey, you're missing some things here. And I think that's a fun experience. I've had people do that to me in creative things where I'm like, something's off. I don't know what it is. And they're like, it's just a few of these things. And you're like, what the hell? That's exactly what it was missing. And I think it's fun because then now you can realize that. So now the novice can now go on after the story ends as he gains more experience and become that person for the next generation of artists.
And Joey, to that point, it is the master who's talking to the more experienced of the two artists. And he says to him, you may know your syntax thoroughly and make no blunders in your grammar, but it takes that and something more to make a great poet. So throughout this work, he is comparing painters and sculptors to poets. I loved that cross-discipline approach to art. It's like when I talk about art, I'm also talking about literature in my own personal life. It's a painting, it's a sculpture, it's a textile. All of the things encompass art. And I just really appreciated that being called out in a story.
Yeah, I think Borges would appreciate this comparison as well, because you don't really need to understand a painting to appreciate it. You don't need to understand poetry to appreciate it.
That is absolutely true. And Joey, there's also a love story in here, both real and imagined. And I also appreciated that. How did that land for you?
I generally wouldn't pay attention as closely to love stories unless the main plot is supposed to be a romance. I'm more interested in Fraunhofer's romance, if you want to call it that, with his painting than the ones with Goldielands.
That is interesting for me, Joey, because I was very compelled by the story of the young artist who has nothing. He comes back to his flat where he has this beautiful woman who just sits there hanging on his every word. And he was like, you will not believe the experience I had today. I stumbled into this place. I met these amazing artists. And he looked around his place. He's like, I'm an artist with no tools to do my art. I don't have the resources to let everything in my head be expressed. The woman is like, well, you have me and I model for you. And if we lose our love, we've lost everything. And he's like, you're right. We have each other. We have love. I would never do anything to damage that. And she's like, good. That's what I was going for. Right answer. Then we have this obsessive master who imagines a woman and creates her and is so preachy. I don't think there's any other word. The young artist comes in with the more experienced painter and he was like, yeah, I would never ever want anyone to see my model. Then the guy who has no girlfriend, the older painter, says, this young guy, he has a beautiful woman. Maybe you can just use her as your model and then we can see the painting. They even said it was like a woman for woman swap. And there was this big lecture about, is it right for the man to offer up his partner without her consent? All of these questions. She's like, oh, now that I know that you'd be upset and jealous that I'm posing for this man, I will pose because that proves that you loved me. So it was this sort of complicated, childish feeling, but she did say something very eloquent, and I hope I can pull this up, Joey, about what would happen when love was lost. And it just made me really sad for them. Balzac wrote, the flower of love soon fades, but the flower of art is immortal. Another section says, for all human sentiments, there is a time of early blossoming, a day of generous enthusiasm that gradually fades until nothing is left of happiness but a memory, and glory is known for a delusion. And of all these delicate and short-lived emotions, none so resemble love as the passion of a young artist for his art, as he is about to enter on the blissful martyrdom of his career of glory and disaster, of vague expectations and real disappointments. And I think anyone who has experienced the blush of first love, you got these great expectations and a world of disappointments probably ahead of you because you are probably not capable of experiencing all there is to experience in these young love affairs. So that really resonated with me. There are beautiful things to be had, but there will be disappointments that you can't even imagine yet, including the disappointment of seeing the painting and being like, say what? I don't see it.
Yeah, this is certainly more realistic than the literary traditions or before Balzac. So I could see why that's something that he is very much known for, because that's the reality. Not all love stories are happily ever after. Sometimes they're just like, this could go bad.
And she says to her artist boyfriend before they go to the place where she's going to have to make this decision, and says, if our love dies, if I plant a long regret in my heart, your fame will be the reward of my obedience to your wishes. Will it not? Let us go in. I shall live on as a memory on your palette. That shall be life for me afterwards. Already she has this feeling of foreboding. I don't think we should do this. And then he's like, well, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. And she's like, okay, so now you're talking to me as a child, and now I have to assert my willingness to do this. It was interesting to think this was written in 1831. For me, I know I'm looking at it as a modern feminist lens of consent and power and who's controlling the situation, but it was just so interesting. She's like, I know that this is going to put a seed of regret. You just planted that seed of regret in our relationship. I want to write it down in my journal right now because someday this is going to come back and bite us. And I hope your fame is worth what we're about to give up. And he's like, no, I don't want to do it. 100%. Your love is the most important thing until I get the chance of fame. And then I just do it.
Downfall of many. That and money.
Yeah, he did take money for his first sketch. It was very funny because the older painter who the young person came to see, they're sort of talking shop about painting, and he jumps in with a point that he disagreed on. And they're like, oh, we can see you actually have opinions about art. If you're so smart, why don't you draw something? So he does his thing and he's like, what's your name? And he signs it. The master, Ferndorfer, says, how much for that? I'm going to buy it from you. And he's like, oh, I couldn't sell it to you. And the middle-aged artist is like, dude, he has a king's ransom in his purse. Just take it. Anytime somebody says, can I buy your art? The answer is yes. It's always yes. So I just thought that was also very interesting that the kid comes back and he's like, my first signed painting got money.
Now he's a legitimate artist.
He got paid for his work and then they stole his soul. Not really, but maybe.
And a tragic ending, because obviously Frenthofer burns his own stuff, which just feels like a very common thing to do. I think Nikolai Gogol did that before he died. He burned his work. Yeah, in real life. Because there was supposed to be a second follow-up to his only novel, and he burned it. Franz Kafka obviously very famously said to destroy all his work after his death, and they did not, thankfully.
His friends didn't listen.
Yeah,
Thank
they were
you.
like, oh, you're dead, so whatever.
We're in charge now. Joey, the other thing that I loved about the story, and I will leave it at this, is there were so many references to Greek myth, painters across time, based on true historical figures. Some were invented, some were real. I just love that. One of the things that he said is one of Rembrandt's portraits might have stepped down from its frame to walk in an appropriate atmosphere of gloom, such as the great painter loved. He was also sort of dissing on the darkness of Rembrandt. And I have been in conversations recently with others about the things they love most about paintings. And this idea of having a very dark painting with a pool of light in the center that just really draws your attention and it just amplifies the shadows. That moodiness really came through for me in that sentence. It's like, that looks like somebody who'd just step out, but they are stepping out of a shadow because Rembrandt, apparently in the view of Balzac, was a little sad. He just had a kind of a darkness pervading everywhere, which I am not an art person, so I can't tell you if that's true or not.
Interpretation.
Great. So, Joey, any closing thoughts on this beautiful story that we read? Thank you for bringing it to us.
No problem. It continues our June of art. This was a great story. If you really love reading about art and artists talking about art specifically, this one was a bit more on the nose that we're going to have read this month. But it is still a great story, so I highly suggest it. It's probably free to read online.
Yeah,
old.
I got mine from the Gutenberg Project, so that is easy to access. And Joey, I also wanted to mention that if you are new to reading French authors of this time, this was very accessible and fun and beautifully written, but not overdone. Sometimes my problem with French writers, I'm just like, please come on, just get on with it. And I did not have many moments of that in this story. So I was very happy. And he had some just lovely French turns of phrases that I'm just like, that was really worth it. Joey, this is my endorsement of why someone who hasn't read a lot of French literature may want to read this. There were plaster busts stood around the room, and here and there, on shelves and tables, lay fragments of classical sculpture torsos of antique goddesses worn smooth as though all the years of all the centuries that had passed over them had been lovers' kisses. So there's a little bit of sensuality, there's a little bit of playfulness, there's this idea of endless time reshaping art and how many people's eyes have gazed on this thing over all the years that had been in existence. And I just really thought that was lovely. So if you are up for reading something from a French author and you're not sure about it, I think this is a very approachable place to start.
He has a huge backlist. So if you really like it, you could explore a lot of his work. There's plenty to go around.
About 100. Yeah. Great, Joey. Do we want to talk about next week?
Yes. So next week, we're going to be reading Downtown by Zadie Smith. Thank you so much for watching or listening today. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe, and follow us on TikTok.
Great. See you later, Joey.